Would you have one more mic?
Many, too many.
Length of the talk.
Take.
When you use, I can't.
Yeah, no, I'll give it to you after. Okay?
So once we start, complete silence.
Yeah. The mobile should be off.
Needed.
In case our Wi-Fi fails,
Hmm.
that will not.
Oh, I see, there is, yeah.
It's already online.
50s.
6 o'clock you can start.
6
7 o'clock, 6:55. So I am still in that one.
A house made for
Hmm. And there are hundreds, thousand people will join.
all over.
All over. Already some are logged in, no?
Some are there, no? Already? Some are logged in?
16.
Ah, 16.
people are there. Here maybe
No, here,
How many you are speaking already?
how many? 16, 16,
1 6.
oh. So,
Please don't switch on your audio.
Audio, kindly mute your
If you are using headphone, it's fine.
Father Ralph is making YouTube debut today.
My YouTube, yes.
Okay,
Okay.
start. Start.
dear friends, I am very happy to present to you Reverend Father Ralph DeCosta, a veteran scripture scholar and theologian. He will be presenting the salient features of the social encyclical Fratelli Tutti by our beloved Pope Francis. Father Ralph is an octogenarian, and at the moment he is the curator of our museum and archives of St. Joseph's College. After completing his theological studies and ordination in Rome back in 1968, he was appointed as the Dean of the Jesuit Juniorate at Mount St. Joseph, Bangalore. Thereafter he taught at St. Joseph Seminary, and once again he went to Biblicum, Rome for his further studies and obtained licentiate in sacred scriptures. He taught for decades at St. Joseph's Seminary, Mangalore. He was also appointed rector of St. Aloysius College, Mangalore, and during his tenure he laid the foundation stone of two blocks, the IT block and the Xavier Research block. He was called upon to be the rector of the Jesuit College, Dinoblic College in Pune, and once again he moved to the Jesuit Curia in Rome. Father Ralph has been a spiritual father, a retreat preacher, and most of all, a great theologian and scripture scholar and scripture teacher. The encyclical Fratelli Tutti calls for fraternity and solidarity, and with an earnest plea by Pope Francis to reject wars. We have seen the civilizations wiped out, Egyptian, Iraq, Mesopotamian and Roman civilizations full of destruction and decimation because of the wars which have taken place. And therefore Pope Francis says no more wars. He also focuses on the contemporary social and economic problems the world is facing and proposes an ideal world in which all countries can be part of a larger human family, a world in which there is justice and peace. We are very happy that Father Ralph is here to do this presentation. I welcome Father Ralph now to expose this document, Fratelli Tutti.
Thank you, Father Enzyclical, for your introduction, singing my praises. But I think when one reaches old age, one is very badly in need of somebody to sing one's praises, because there's not much to look forward to. It is also my privilege, thanks to Father Sweebert, the rector of this house, to give you an introduction to this encyclical. Now, as we approach this encyclical, normally people are asked not to introduce the encyclical, but to comment on the encyclical. Now, understanding that this encyclical is practically 200 pages in this book, I don't suppose any one of you expects to have a commentary just now on 200 pages of that text. But what I will try to do is to introduce you to what is called the social encyclical. Now, everything seems strange. Social encyclical. You've heard of dogmatic encyclicals, liturgical encyclicals, etc. But a social encyclical is something new. Again, as you see, this encyclical is addressed by Pope Francis, not just to the Catholic or even the Christian community. It's addressed to every person of goodwill, and I would say also to every person who should be filled with goodwill. Now, as I said, I am not going to give you a commentary on this encyclical, but fortunately, as soon as this encyclical came out at Assisi, immediately the Catholic press, especially in the Vatican, began to give us summaries of this encyclical. And what I'll be working on now is the long summary given by Isabella Piro of Vatican City, obviously one of the staff members of the press in Vatican City, who wrote this long summary of Francis' social encyclical, and also a short summary of the same encyclical. But the short summary presumes too much. So I thought perhaps it will be more useful as an introduction to this encyclical to take up her longer summary. Now, first and foremost, as I said, we are talking about a social encyclical. Now, I think this is only the third encyclical that Pope Francis has written. He's written a lot, letters, etc., etc., but this is the third encyclical that he has written. And obviously it means that this must be of very, very grave importance, not only for the Catholics or for the Christians, but for all men of goodwill and for all men who should become men of goodwill. Now, normally when we take encyclicals, and if you look at the footnotes given at the end of the encyclical, you will find endless references to the scriptures, both Old and New Testament. You'll find reference to the fathers of the church, and then you would also find reference to the popes, either quoting themselves or quoting one of their predecessors. But when we look at the footnotes to this encyclical of Pope Francis, we see he is not very much bothered about giving us references to the sacred scriptures. He is not even interested in quoting himself too often. But he does quote, and not only himself, but people of every faith, even of no faith. All men and women must must be able to observe what he is pointing out to us if we want our world to have any future. Now, as you look at what the Pope has in mind, we see he must be really thinking we are in a serious crisis. He had mentioned this earlier when he published Laudato Si, but this time he's putting it very plainly and very clearly that if we are not united, we are all going to perish. And therefore it is a call to a world that is at the summit of a disaster which can affect not just a few, but affect the very existence of humanity on this earth. He will also tell us that it was not this virus that prompted him to start work on his encyclical. He had started work much earlier on this encyclical, and the virus happened to come in when he had already written some pages, but it put for him all that he was saying in clearer focus of the need for fraternity, the need for solidarity, the need for communion and community. Now, as I said, the background to this encyclical is all that Pope Francis has been saying from whenever he became Pope. And when he has taken this title, Fratelli Tutti, again he has borrowed it from his favorite saint, whose name he took when he became the Pope, St. Francis of Assisi. He is, I guess, familiar with the writings of Francis of Assisi. And therefore, in the Franciscan order, there is this custom that when the superior or the one in charge of the house or the congregation wants to draw the attention of others, his fellow companions, to some important point, then he would begin his talk with Fratelli Tutti. So, he's telling us, when you read this encyclical, which I am presenting to you with the introduction of Fratelli Tutti, what I am trying to tell you is, there are serious things that are to be considered in what I am writing. And things which are serious and must be taken seriously and must be acted upon immediately. There is no time for discussion and debate, etc. But the world is at a point where a decision has to be reached and put into practice if we want the world to continue. Now, there are some, of course, who always must find something to criticize, who said, why Fratelli Tutti? Why have we excluded more than half of the population of this world, women? Because Fratelli refers only to brothers. But these, as I said, are things which should not concern us at all. If he has told us that this is borrowed from the writings of the Franciscans and especially of Francis of Assisi, he says, take it in the context in which Francis of Assisi wrote to his brethren, Fratelli Tutti. So therefore it is an admonition to all of us who are able to read this. An admonition does not necessarily mean correction with punishment. Admonition means giving you a warning that what is contained in the advice that follows is something serious to be taken seriously. It is not for endless discussion, certainly it is not for entertainment, but it is for serious consideration, discussion, and above all, for action. Now that is why he begins his encyclical with these two words, Fratelli Tutti, taken obviously from the Italian of Francis of Assisi, which only means all you brothers. Today you would say all you men and women of goodwill. So we see that is the extent to which this encyclical is being directed. Now what we must look for as we go through this encyclical are the various points that Pope Francis is drawing our attention to. Now as he is going to do this, you see, first and foremost he tells us that the inspiration to write such an encyclical has come long, long ago to him. We all know, for example, how he had paid a visit to the Islamic leader in 2019 February for the sole purpose of discussing with him how the whole of the Muslim community could work together with other men and women of goodwill and bring about peace, communion, harmony in our world. That is one occasion. It made history, because you've never ever heard of a pope going to visit an Islamic leader and to talk together in great peace and harmony without beginning another war again. But he took the first step. He wanted to bring about reconciliation. He wanted to bring about harmony, communion, not just between Muslims and Christians, but between all men and women of goodwill spread all over the world. Now, if this was, as we said, in 2020, no, earlier than that, we said it was in 2019, the Pope has spent a lot of time meeting the heads of states, meeting other important people who come to visit him, going around the world, meeting not only Christians but the leaders of other religions. And you'll see again and again what the Pope has been talking about is how do we bring about the solidarity of mankind? How do we bring about peace? How do we bring about harmony? How do we bring about communion? How do we save our world from totally destroying itself? So you see, that has been constantly in the mind of Pope Francis. And therefore he thought it fit that he should write this encyclical, and he calls it a social encyclical, because he is going to take human society as you find it today. And he is not going to mince his words as he looks at human society today, analyzes it, and does not get carried away by the wonderful progress that our world is making, but he is looking at our world and seeing the tragedy that has befallen our world and the crisis into which our world has plunged itself, and the very rapid outcome of this crisis into which it has fallen. Now, in that sense, could we say it is an admonition? It is a warning. Open your minds, open your eyes, open your ears, open your hearts. Do something about our world where you are. Now, we can interpret that title in many ways. Now, to come back to the encyclical, you see, first the Pope gives us a sort of an introduction to what he is saying. And he says, what are the great ideals, but also the tangible ways to advance for those who wish to build a more just and fraternal world in their ordinary relationships, in social life, politics, and institutions? This is mainly the question that Fratelli Tutti is intended to answer. And therefore the Pope describes it as a social encyclical, which borrows the title of the admonitions of St. Francis of Assisi, who used these words to address his brothers and sisters and propose to them a way of life marked by the flavor of the gospel. Now see, the Pope is not going to give us here philosophy, psychology, techniques, etc. What the Pope is going to tell us is, how does God, who sent Jesus, his Son, into this world, intend us to listen, to understand the words of Jesus, which he tells us is the good news. And once we understand how it is the good news, how does our Heavenly Father intend us to put that good news into practice, so that his plan for humankind and for the world might be realized. We can hear the warning. If you don't take these words of God given us by Jesus seriously, the world is going to work itself into extinction. He's not beating around the bush. He comes down to the reality. And therefore he says, Francis of Assisi did not want to wage a war. That was the intention at that time, crusades and all the rest, to bring about peace, subdue your enemy by a war. But rather, he wanted to bring about peace by bringing the words of Jesus into the reality of everyday's life, so that the love of God would become really the good news that man hears and puts into practice. Now, with that, he next moves to explain why he is speaking about fratelli, namely brothers and sisters. If you talk about brothers and sisters, it means there must be one common progenitor. Otherwise you can't have brothers and sisters. There must be a common parent. Now, who is the common parent of all humanity? Francis has no hesitation to tell us it is God the Father. And if it is God the Father who is the common creator, the maker of all men and women on this world, then we must allow his plan to enter into the world, to guide us and to bring us to observe it, and therefore to bring that plan to completion. So you see why he is using that word made sacred by Francis of Assisi, but before that coming from God the Father himself. Now with that fratelli, and then afterwards speaking of God as the creator, he says we must be aware that in a globalized and interconnected world, only together can we be saved. Now again, this is a point that he has been emphasizing. We cannot save ourselves individually. We cannot save ourselves by being different communities. We have to save ourselves as one common family. Now, is the world in its present day structures attempting at all to make the world into one common family? And therefore we will have some very hard words to say about the United Nations. It tells us that the United Nations has defeated its purpose. It has become just one more tool to divide humanity and to follow the philosophy of this world, total selfishness, each one for himself. The more powerful one is, the more rights one possesses. That could not be the purpose of the United Nations. And therefore he says that has to be changed. And then he'll also tell us that all these words that we use, and use so often in the politics of the world today, have lost their original meaning. Politics has lost its original meaning. Democracy has lost its original meaning. Community has lost its meaning. Anything you speak about, there are as many meanings given to that word as the number of people who use that word. Now, that could never have been God's idea. And therefore, how do we bring about a community where everybody is brother or sister to the other? And therefore, as he goes on in his writing, he will tell us that we must find a better kind of politics which is not subordinated to financial interests, but to serving the common good, able to place the dignity of every human being at the center and assure work to everyone, so that each one can develop his or her own abilities. A politics which is removed from populism is able to find solutions to what attacks fundamental human rights and which aims to definitively eliminate hunger and trafficking. At the same time, Pope Francis underscores that a more just world is achieved by promoting peace, which is not merely the absence of war. It demands craftsmanship, a job that involves everyone. Linked to truth, peace and reconciliation must be proactive. They must work towards justice through dialogue in the name of mutual development. And therefore the Pope condemns all war, because war is the negation of all rights. It is no longer conceivable, even in a hypothetically justified form, because nuclear, chemical, and biological weapons already have enormous repercussions on innocent civilians. Then, there is also a strong rejection of the death penalty, defined as inadmissible, and a central reflection on forgiveness connected to the concepts of remembrance and justice. To forgive does not mean to forget, the Pontiff writes, not to give up defending one's rights to safeguard one's dignity, which is a gift from God. In the background of the encyclical is the COVID-19 pandemic, which Francis reveals unexpectedly erupted as he was writing this letter. But the global health emergency has helped demonstrate that no one can face life in isolation, and that the time has truly come to dream then as a single human family in which we are brothers and sisters all. Now this is a sort of an introduction to the whole of the encyclical. When you come to the encyclical, he divides it into 8 chapters. And each chapter has a particular theme, and he works on that theme. Now, as I said, when he's working on that theme, he's falling back on his own writings, his own speeches. He's falling back on what men and women of goodwill have said through the centuries, independently of whether they are Christian or not. And therefore he works out each chapter. And in chapter 1, what he tells us is that we are here going to deal with global problems and global actions. And he tells us if we look at these global problems and global actions, dark clouds cover a closed world. The document reflects on the many distortions of the contemporary era, the manipulation and deformation of concepts such as democracy, freedom, justice. the loss of the meaning of the social community and history, selfishness and indifference towards the common good, the prevalence of a market logic based on the profit and the culture of waste, unemployment, racism, poverty, the disparity of rights and its aberrations such as slavery, trafficking women, subjugated and then forced to abort. Organ trafficking deals with global problems that can call for global actions. And this is why the Pope says that he is sounding an alarm against a culture of walls that favors the proliferation of organized crime fueled by fear and loneliness. Moreover, today we observe a deterioration of ethics, contributed in a certain way by the mass media, which shatter respect for others and eliminate all discretion, creating isolated and self-referential virtual circles in which freedom is an illusion and dialogue is not constructive. So it tells us dark clouds cover our world. What he just said in this paragraph are those dark clouds. And you see, today I don't think the world really wants to look at the dark clouds, because with all these media of communication, etc., what the world wants is to distract itself, and distract itself in any way possible. Distract itself from the baby in the crib right up till the old person dying in his bed or on the roadside. Keep yourself distracted. Don't try to penetrate into the meaning of anything. Now, the Pope is asking us, can a world continue if all that it seeks is distraction and superficiality? Obviously, we'll touch all these points which he gave us here, which our world is distracted with, and expect us to reflect seriously on them. That's why the admonition, Fratelli, and then come to see what can we do about it. And again, he is emphasizing, he's not talking about what an individual can do. He's not talking about what one community or the other can do, but he's talking about what we all together as humanity, as Fratelli, must do, because that is what is going to happen to our world. We will go our way of selfishness, we will destroy the other in our selfishness, and at the end we will be destroyed, having destroyed our own world. So now you see how that is already anticipated in Laudato Si. And now here he is coming and telling us, it's not only nature, but the human person whom human beings are seeking to destroy. Then when he comes to the second chapter, he tells us, is there any solution to this problem in the world? And strangely, he says, the solution is that of the Good Samaritan. Love must build bridges. And if you want to know how love must build bridges, he says, look at the Good Samaritan. So that he is a stranger on the road. And as he is a stranger on the road, he sees other strangers on the road. Now, what does he do? Because he is a healthy person, what he does is to turn his back on himself. Look at the other person who is suffering. And as we look at our world, suffering, illiterate, frail, vulnerable. What are we called to do for this world? Can each one of us be a good Samaritan to the others? Can we truly become a neighbor to the others? Are we prepared to overcome prejudices? Are we able to overcome personal interests, historic and cultural barriers? We are co-responsible in creating a society that is able to include, integrate, and lift up those who have fallen or are suffering. Love builds bridges, and we were made for love. Now, if that is so, how can we build bridges? And here he's speaking directly to Christians. Recognize Christ in the face of every excluded person. The principle of the capacity to love, according to a universal dimension, is also returned to in the 3rd chapter, envisaging and engendering an open world. And therefore Francis in this chapter exhorts us to go outside the self in order to find a fuller existence in another. Opening ourselves up to the other according to the dynamism of charity, which makes us tend towards universal fulfillment. In the background, the encyclical recalls, the spiritual nature of a person's life is measured by love. And it must always take first place and leads us to seek better for the life of the other, far from all selfishness. Then he moves onwards, and when he moves onwards, he tells us that rights have no borders. What does he mean? We have divided the world into countries, nations, states, etc. We have fitted borders, and you cannot transgress these borders. The same thing happens in the domestic world. The same thing happens in every country, the rich and the poor. In India, of course, we have the whole of the caste system, we have all the religious fanaticism, etc. So what he tells us is, rights have no borders. Now, do we believe in that? That fundamental rights belong to everyone. We can't put borders for fundamental rights. But is that really practiced in the world today? He says, in this particular, to achieve this type of society, benevolence or truly wanting good for the other, and solidarity which cares for fragility and is expressed in service to people and not to ideologies, fighting against poverty and inequality. The right to live with dignity cannot be denied to anyone. Rights have no borders. One can remain excluded regardless of where they are born. In this perspective, the Pontiff also calls us to consider an ethics of international relations, because every country also belongs to foreigners, and the goods of the territory cannot be denied to those who are in need and come from another place. Now see here very clearly he's talking about migrants. He's talking about refugees. We put up borders and you say you cannot cross. But is that really what it means to be brother to everybody else in the world? The natural right to private property will be secondary to the principle of the universal destination of created goods. So, when you look at the Pope and what he's writing here, really says take all the structures we are so painfully built up over the centuries and throw them all into the depths of the sea. Begin a new world according to the gospel of Jesus. And therefore, when you look at it from this dimension, we'd obviously tell ourselves we are fighting a losing battle. But then that's why the Pope, right through his pontificate, has been insisting on hope. We cannot give up hope. Because if we give up hope, there's nothing left except the dark clouds of destruction and disaster. And he's telling us that here once again. Then he tells us migrants of global governance for long-term planning. This is what he gives you in the 4th chapter of this encyclical. A heart open to the whole world, with their lives at stake, fleeing from war, persecution, natural catastrophes, unscrupulous trafficking, ripped from their communities of origin, migrants are to be welcomed, protected, supported, and integrated. Unnecessary migration needs to be avoided. At the same time, we need to respect the right to seek a better life elsewhere. In receiving countries, the right balance will be between the protection of citizens' rights and the guarantee of welcome and assistance for migrants. And therefore, he speaks of several indispensable steps, especially in response to those who are fleeing grave humanitarian crisis, to increase and simplify the granting of visas, to open humanitarian corridors, to assure lodging, security, and essential services, to offer opportunities for employment and training, to favor family reunifications, to protect minors, to guarantee religious freedom and promote social inclusion. The Pope calls, therefore, for establishing in society the concept of full citizenship, and thus reject the discriminatory use of the term minorities. So you see, what he's talking here is a global governance. And I said, when we read this, I think all of us are skeptics. But we will say, yes, good dreams, but centuries have passed. Things have gone worse rather than better. Will Francis make a difference? But what he's asking is not, will Francis make a difference? He's asking, has Jesus made a difference? And if Jesus has made a difference, has he made a difference in your life? Because that is the joy of the gospel. That was his first letter. So, if the joy of the gospel is what Jesus came to give everyone in the world, are we experiencing the joy of the gospel and helping others to experience that same joy of the gospel? And therefore he tells us, others who are different from us are a gift and enrichment for all. Differences represent an opportunity for growth. A healthy culture is a welcoming culture that is able to open up to others without renouncing itself, offering them something authentic. In a polyhedron, an image dear to the pontiff, the whole is more than its single parts. But the value of each one of them is respected. Then he comes to the 5th chapter and talks about politics, which is a valuable form of charity. I think this is something shocking to the ordinary man, that politics is a valuable form of charity. Now, he says it places at the service of the common good, recognizes the importance of people, understood as an open category, available for discussion and dialogue. In a certain sense, the populism indicated by Francis, which counters that populism which ignores the legitimacy of the notion of people by attracting consensuses in order to exploit them for his own service and fomenting selfishness in order to increase its own popularity. But a better politics also, one that protects work, an essential dimension of social life, and seeks to ensure everyone the opportunity to develop their own abilities. The best help to a poor person is not through money, but it is allowing him or her to have a dignified life through work. Now see, again, there's a completely new dimension that the Pope is giving to politics. So, can we guarantee through all the politics of each state and each country and the whole world that everyone will find and experience the dignity of work and thereby the dignity of the human person? We had a dreadful experience of the migrant workers. Did they experience any dignity in their life? They were treated worse than cattle, worse than objects. Now, is that what all our politics can effect in this world after so many centuries? And if we go through any of the constitutions, you'll find a lot of praise for politics, for policies, etc. But we saw the outcome of all that in the recent situation of the migrant workers, the refugees, etc. So therefore, that is what he asks of us here. Seek definitively to eliminate trafficking, a source of shame for humanity, and hunger, which is criminal, because food is an inalienable right. Then he moves to the next paragraph and he says the marketplace by itself cannot resolve every problem. It requires a reform of the United Nations. Now, when he tells us that the marketplace cannot resolve every problem, we see how he is hitting directly at the economic policy of every country. We are busy preparing budgets, profit and loss account, import and export. What are we really trying to do? Make the market control our life. But what is the consequence of submitting our whole self to the economics of the market? Who produces, who enjoys the product? Now, with this virus, we have found there's nobody to produce. And supposing you get people to produce, there's nobody to purchase. Why? Because people have no money. And people have no money because they have no work. And they have no work because the politics of the government has nothing to offer them. Now for us, this is a living reality. Because here we have seen, for example, in the building which was coming up, once the lockdown started, what happened to everything? And even today, there is no lockdown. But what has happened to our roads? What has happened to our shops? We know the unemployed that is present in every one of these high-rise buildings. We know the loans. The government may be attempting to lower the interest on loans further to time you can pay it back, etc. But who is going to give you a job? If they cannot make money, they cannot pay you. And you can take a loan, but how will you ever pay it back? So see, if we make the market as the ultimate criterion, then you have reduced the human being not to a spiritual being, not to someone who has a dignity of his own. He is a tool which can be used and disposed of by the one who has the money in his hand. And therefore it tells us the marketplace itself cannot resolve every problem. Then he says, but what happened to your United Nations? That was supposed to have solved all the problems after the Second World War. What has happened to that United Nations? Who controls it? Who governs its policies? Is it not the one who has money and who has military power? And he has military power because he has the money. And he has the money because he has used it to provide arms, armaments, etc. Now, is that all that the United Nations could do? Does anybody take the United Nations seriously today? India is fighting for a place on the Permanent Security Council, but why can't it get that place? Why is that group of 5 supposed to be controlling the destiny of the whole of the universe? See, therefore the Pope, without using all these details, is telling us, you may boast about the United Nations as human effort at providing justice for all. Has it? And therefore look at things clearly. Don't let shadows come in the way, but look at things clearly and let the light, which is Christ, shine on the reality that you are watching. Then he comes to the 6th chapter where he speaks about the miracle of kindness. So, dialogue and friendship in society further emerges as the concept of life as the art of encounter with everyone, even with the world's peripheries and with original peoples, because each of us can learn something from others. No one is useless and no one is expendable. True dialogue indeed is what allows one to respect the point of view of others, their legitimate interests, and above all the truth of human dignity. Relativism is not a solution, because without universal principles and moral norms that prohibit intrinsic evil, laws become merely arbitrary impositions. And therefore what he tells us is a generous encounter and closeness with the least that promotes proximity and the sense of human family is what we must try to build up. And that will come about through the miracle of kindness. So see, what the Pope is telling us clearly here is, this is not human effort. Because we say we can't perform miracles. Who performs miracles? God. So the miracle of kindness must come to us as a gift from God. Are we ready to accept that gift? Because he tells us a kind person creates a healthy coexistence and opens paths in places where exasperation burns bridges. Then he moves onwards and he comes to the art of peace and the importance of forgiveness. In other words, he's telling us that the paths of renewed encounter will bring about a peace which is connected to truth, justice, and mercy. Far from the desire for vengeance, this is proactive, aims at forming a society based on service to others, on the pursuit of reconciliation and mutual development. In a society, everyone must feel at home. Thus, peace is an art that involves and regards everyone, and in which each one must do his or her part. Peace building is an open-ended endeavor, a never-ending task, and thus it is important to place the human person, his or her dignity, and the common good at the center of all activity. Then he speaks about forgiveness. Forgiveness is linked to peace. We must love everyone without exception. But loving an oppressor means helping him to change and not allowing him to continue oppressing his neighbor. On the contrary, one who suffers an injustice must vigorously defend his rights in order to safeguard his dignity, a gift of God. Forgiveness does not mean impunity, but rather justice and remembrance, because to forgive does not mean to forget, but to renounce the destructive power of evil and the desire for revenge. Never forget horrors like the Shoah, the atomic bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, persecutions, ethnic massacres. They must be remembered always anew, so as not to become anesthetized and to keep the flame of collective conscience alive. It is just as important to remember the good and those who have chosen forgiveness and fraternity. So see, here the Pope is going directly against that popular saying, forgive and forget. He says forgive and forgive always, but certain things you cannot and must not forget. But he does not ask you, must we forgive and forget? He says no, because the memory of what has been unjust must spur us to bringing about a world of justice, peace and love. Now that is what those who began these museums, etc., in Germany to commemorate the Holocaust had in mind. But as we look at our country, we don't see anywhere forgiveness. Old memories are being dug up, forced into the public gaze, fixed up with holidays and statues, etc. Now, will India ever come to enjoy peace? Because we are not cultivating love, we are cultivating hatred. And with hatred, we are not allowing peace to grow, but rather we are fostering war. Call it whatever you want, terrorism, etc., etc. But that is war. And therefore, as the Pope continues, he tells us never again war. Because war only affirms a failure of humanity. So in the 7th chapter, he says, focus on war. It is not a ghost from the past, but it is a constant threat, and it represents the negation of all rights, a failure of politics and of humanity, a stinging defeat before the forces of evil which lies in their abyss. Moreover, due to nuclear, chemical and biological weapons that strike many innocent civilians, today we can no longer think, as in the past, of the possibility of a just war. We must vehemently affirm, never again war. And as he goes on, we see he introduces us to the next point. The death penalty is inadmissible. Now, all of us have studied moral theology. You know the endless discussions, especially after the Second World War, as to whether the death penalty is Christian. And all types of casuistry was used to say that in certain cases it is recommended so that society could be preserved. But now Pope Francis says the death penalty is inadmissible, it is to be abolished. Because not even a murderer loses his personal dignity. God himself pledges to guarantee this. And therefore what he tells us is punishment can never be vindictive. It must be a process of healing, of social regeneration. And therefore we must work to improve prison conditions which respect the human dignity of inmates, also considering that a life sentence is a secret death penalty. Then finally, in the last chapter, is a long chapter on guaranteeing religious freedom. Now, when he tells us we must guarantee religious freedom, because he said that is a fundamental human right for all believers. And it's a fundamental right for all human believers. The Church does not restrict her mission to the private sphere. She does not remain at the margins of society, and while not engaging in politics, she does not renounce the political dimension of life itself. Attention to the common good and concern for integral human development in fact concerns humanity, and that all that is human concerns the Church. And then he goes back to what he had said when he signed the document with Al-Azhar, etc. Then as you go through the encyclical, he closes the encyclical with two prayers. One prayer which he tells you is a prayer to the Creator, and another prayer is an ecumenical Christian prayer. And he says in all this, he drew his inspiration from Charles de Foucault. Now we won't read the prayer because each prayer takes one page here. So I've taken much more than the time given, but I hope that you got some idea of the richness of this encyclical. It's not meant to be summarized, but it is supposed to be amplified through personal reflection, and perhaps this would do a lot of good for us if we could use this in our discussions rather than discussing useless things. So with that. Over.